Matt Chorley on Times Radio.
Morning, nice to have you with us. Now, the government is laying out the details of its online safety bill. Among the measures being announced, social media companies will be forced to hand over their algorithms to Ofcom so they can see whether they're promoting harmful content. A new duty of care will be introduced. And interestingly, prison time for Silicon Valley bosses if they fail. There'll also be a ban on the promotion of self-harming, which will be regulated for the first time. Ian Russell has been campaigning for this after his daughter Molly took her own life in 2017 at the age of 14 after seeing graphic images of self-harm and suicide on Instagram. He spoke to Luke and Asma on Times Radio Breakfast this morning and said that companies like the Instagram owners, Meta, need to be held to account.
I think it's really important that the sanctions behind the online safety bill, behind the regulator Ofcom, are stringent enough to refocus the corporate culture of big tech. These are huge, global, powerful companies, and without a massive impetus, they will continue to do what they've done for the last 18 or so years in the case of Meta or Facebook or that group. And to change corporate culture is difficult. So the big fines that are there are one measure, but these companies are very rich. There's nothing quite like the threat of a criminal sentence aimed at the senior managers of big companies to focus their minds and help them make the changes to make their platforms safe that they should have made themselves when they had the opportunity.
That was Ian Russell, father of Molly, speaking to Times Radio this morning. Well, let's have a look a bit more in detail at what this bill's actually going to involve. Emily Taylor is Chief Executive of the Oxford Information Labs and editor of Chatham House's Journal of Cyber Policy. Hi, Emily.
Hi, Matt.
Pick out for us then what is in the bill, which is significant, or perhaps what isn't in there that you might have expected to have been included.
Thank you. Well, regulating speech is really difficult, and democracies have been rightly hesitant to bring forward regulation. The text that's being is going to be presented to Parliament today. We're expecting something very lengthy. This has had a huge gestation period. This really can trace its life back to all of the electoral interference and the harms over social media during the 2016 era. And of course, we just heard from the father of Molly Russell there, the idea that young and vulnerable users like her could access materials that promoted self-harm, that almost like encouraging very, very vulnerable young people into really dark paths. Clearly, there is an awful lot to worry about. It is expected to be a bit of a monster in size because it's covering so much. It's going to really, really boost the powers of the regulator Ofcom. You mentioned the duty of care. That's been a concept that has been going around since the early days. It's not without its controversy. And really, a lot of this comes back to the fact that regulating speech is difficult. If you don't do it, you risk a sort of overly libertarian environment in which it's just the survival of the fittest, the Molly Russells of this world, the teenagers, the vulnerable users are not sufficiently protected. If you do it, there is always the risk of over-regulation. And we heard Molly Russell's father there talking about, the criminalisation, the threat of imprisonment of senior executives, turnover-based fines. I'm sure that many listeners won't really have very much sympathy for the large platforms or their executives. However, the important thing to bear in mind is what will this do to the corporate culture? What the risk is that by regulating speech, you inhibit speech, that you create incentives to take down content even when it is in the margins. And the recent announcements by the government since February have been like a laundry list of criminalising more and more and more different types of speech. So it's going to be very hard to keep track of, very hard to really understand what the boundaries are, because with speech, context is everything.
And I suppose the thing is that we could end up creating a lot of new offences, but without really chipping away at all, as you were saying, to the enormous global monsters that are these tech firms, who actually probably don't take much notice of fines, particularly, and nor really perhaps even the legal threats, because they'll make sure that they're not personally liable. So is there a risk that we end up essentially sort of curbing free speech, but without actually addressing some of the real concerns that people have?
I think there are two things there. First of all, yes, definitely the civil society voices are definitely warning that actually, rather than having a big laundry list of different types of speech to criminalise, how about legislation that tries to go to the fundamental advertising-based business models and the sort of incentives that those create? I probably would, challenge the assumption that the platform's completely lawless and don't really care. Speaking to colleagues who are implementing, similar laws in Australia and so on, they're putting huge teams and resources to try and comply, but of course, spare a thought for the global platforms, in that they are trying to comply with every law in the world, and that's not easy when they're all different. And even within the continent of Europe, we're going to have the UK doing something slightly different to what the EU is doing.
Yeah. Of course. Emily Taylor, really good speech to you from Oxford Information Labs, updating us on the online safety bill, which is going through Parliament. Keep an eye on that, I'm sure. Up next is the Midday Update here on Times Radio.